The wind scraped hard against the side of the old farmhouse, sounding like someone dragging their nails across dry wood. Grace Whitaker stood at the edge of her daughter's shared room, watching them sleep. Nora curled in a ball, thumb still in her mouth, and Rosie sprawled out like she owned the mattress. She was 8. Nora was 5. Grace didn't know how to tell them they might be gone by morning. She pressed a hand over her mouth to keep from crying too loud, afraid the sound would reach past the paper-thin walls. The house was cold, even with the stove burning. That cold crept into her bones, not just the kind from the drafty windows and weak fire, the kind that came from knowing something was being taken from you, and there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. Grace had done everything she could. Everything. Woke up at 4 to clean other people's floors. Sewed clothes till her fingers bled. Sold off the silver brooch her mama gave her just to buy enough flour to make biscuits for a week. But no one cared about that when they looked at her. They saw a widow, a woman whose husband drank himself into the grave, whose farm couldn't stand one more bad season, whose kids didn't have boots that matched. The judge didn't even look her in the eye when he read the letter from the county. He just shifted in his seat and said the words like they didn't carry weight. Neglect, malnourishment, unsafe living conditions. Then a pause. The girls had been placed with a foster family in Durango. Durango, that might as well have been the edge of the world. The paper with the court stamp still sat on the kitchen table, curling at the corners. She hadn't moved it since yesterday, when the social worker slid it across to her and said in a voice too sweet, "You can appeal, but it'll take time. And by then, they'll already be settled in." Time. That's what no one ever gave her. Not when David got sick and the railroad took away his pay. Not when she begged the church for wood to keep the girls warm. Not when she knocked on every neighbor's door asking for someone to watch the girls while she worked nights. Grace had no family. Her sister died in childbirth in Texas. Her father stopped writing after she married David. She figured maybe he thought she deserved what she got. Outside, the wind rattled the barn doors. Grace wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved through the kitchen on bare feet. The floor was splintered. The oil lamp flickered. Her hands were trembling. There was a long, empty stretch of silence that filled the room, like the breath you take before something breaks. She stared out the window into the dark. No light out there, just flat fields and bare trees. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. The quiet made it louder. Every choice she made, every failure, every time she'd hoped and come up short. Grace had always thought if she worked hard, stayed good, God would meet her halfway. But it didn't feel like he'd been watching for a long time. She sat at the table, folding her hands over the worn wood, trying to think. But there was nothing left to do. The county wagon was due in the morning. That's when the knock came. Not loud, not rushed, just a firm knock. Once, then again. She jumped, her chair scraping across the floor. Her first thought was the sheriff, maybe come early. But it wasn't even 5 yet. Who'd be out here at this hour? She crept toward the door, heartbeat in her ears. She hesitated, then opened it. A man stood on the porch, tall and still like he belonged there. Wide-brimmed hat low over his face. He didn't speak, just looked at her with steady eyes, unreadable in the dark. Her voice caught in her throat. "Can I help you?" No answer. The man reached slowly into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to her. Her fingers trembled as she took it. She opened it under the porch light. Just a few words, written in sharp, careful letters. "You're not alone. Let me help." She stared at the note, then back at him. The wind whipped around them, but the man didn't flinch. He wasn't from the county. That much she knew. They didn't send quiet men with no badge and hands like they'd seen war. She should have been afraid. But something in his silence told her this was the first good thing that had come to her door in a long time. Inside, Rosie stirred in her sleep. Grace heard it through the cracked window. The man didn't move, just waited. Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe. She wanted to let herself fall into the hope, but hope was a dangerous thing. Still, her fingers curled tighter around the paper. "Who sent you?" she whispered. He didn't speak, just tilted his head toward the road, where a horse stood waiting, half hidden in the dark. She thought of all the ways this could go wrong, then thought of Rosie and Nora. Maybe she was foolish, maybe desperate, but she stepped aside and opened the door. "Come in," she said softly. And just like that, the wind stopped howling. The stranger's name was Jackson Brandt, though Grace didn't learn that until the next day. That night, he stepped inside without a word and lowered himself into the farthest corner of the room, sitting close to the stove like a man used to cold nights. He removed his hat, revealing hair dark as ink and streaked with gray at the temples. His eyes, when they caught the light, were neither kind nor cruel, just steady, watchful, as if he saw more than he let on. Grace offered him coffee out of habit. He nodded, didn't thank her, didn't speak. She moved around the kitchen quietly, unsure whether to be comforted or unnerved by his silence. But something in her stilled. She hadn't heard a man's footsteps in her house since David died. And even then, David's steps had grown uncertain toward the end. He lost himself before the bottle took his life. But this man, Jackson, he walked like someone who knew what he stood for. By morning, the girls were awake and curious. Rosie came into the kitchen first, her wild brown curls bouncing, and stopped short when she saw the stranger. She didn't speak, just clutched the doorframe and stared at him, wide-eyed. Grace crouched beside her. "It's all right," she whispered. "He's here to help." Rosie didn't look convinced. But then Nora toddled in, hair sticking up in all directions, dragging her one-eyed doll behind her. She looked at Jackson, then marched straight up and held out the doll. "Her name's Miss Sally. You can hold her." Something broke gently across Jackson's face. Not quite a smile, but something warmer. He accepted the doll like it was a precious thing, cradled it in one large hand, and nodded once at Nora. That was all it took. The girls were hooked. Grace watched them with a knot in her chest. She didn't trust easily. Life had seen to that. But when the girls didn't flinch, she paid attention. Later that morning, the knock came again. This time it was the county wagon. And Grace, her heart pounding, opened the door with Jackson standing just behind her. The woman from the welfare office blinked at him, thrown off by the sight of a man beside Grace. "We're here for the children," she said sharply. Jackson didn't say a word, just took a step forward. It was all it took. The woman looked him up and down, unsure. "And you are?" Grace opened her mouth, but Jackson spoke first. "I'm her legal representative," he said simply. "You don't have authority to remove the children until a formal hearing." His voice was calm, deep, with just the slightest edge of command. He handed her a letter, an actual stamped notice, signed by a lawyer in Santa Fe, calling for a postponement. The woman sputtered, flipped through the pages, and stepped back. Jackson didn't say another word. Just watch her until she got back in the wagon and left. When the dust settled and the road was empty again, Grace nearly collapsed. "Ow," she whispered. "How did you—" Jackson looked at her, then nodded once toward the girls playing with sticks near the barn. "Someone's looking out for you," he said, then turned and walked away without another word. That was the beginning. Over the next few days, Jackson stayed in the shed behind the barn, fixed the hinges on the doors, cleared the field of rocks, repaired the fence where the coyotes had been getting in. He worked like a man with something to prove. Quiet, precise, never asked for thanks. The girls adored him. Rosie followed him around like a shadow. Nora sang songs to him while he split wood. Grace watched, confused, suspicious. She didn't know where he'd come from, didn't know what he wanted. He never mentioned payment, never looked her way too long. But sometimes, late at night, she'd find him sitting on the porch, staring out into the fields like they held answers to questions he'd never asked out loud. Then came the neighbor. Martha Dunley was a bitter woman with thin lips and eyes like broken glass. She had always watched Grace's life from a distance, never offering help, only judgment. She showed up with a pie and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Heard you had a visitor," she said as she stepped into the kitchen without waiting to be invited. "Man's name is Jackson Brandt, you say?" Grace stiffened. "Yes." Martha smiled tighter. You know who he used to ride with? The Carson gang. Stagecoach robbers. Real outlaws. Some say he even killed a man. Of course, he was never tried. Disappeared for a decade. Grace's breath caught. She gripped the back of the chair, words slow to come. You sure he's the kind of man you want around your girls? Martha asked, slicing into the pie like she was cutting flesh. Grace didn't answer. She waited until Martha left, pie untouched, then walked out to the field where Jackson was stacking stones around the well. Did you ride with them? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jackson didn't look up, just kept working. Yes, he said after a moment. I was young, made choices I regret. Did you kill a man? He paused again, wiped sweat from his brow, looked at her with eyes that held no shame, just tired honesty. In self-defense. Once. Never again. Grace stared at him. The silence stretched. Then she turned and walked away, heart pounding. But she didn't tell him to leave, because whatever his past was, he'd stood between her and the county. And the girls trusted him. And deep in her gut, Grace believed a man who had once been lost might know exactly how to save someone else. Still, the whispers started. One by one, folks in town began to notice. Grace at the general store, Jackson outside loading supplies. Grace walking with him along the field lines. A man who'd vanished from the law, now standing like a father behind her girls. The sheriff came next. Sheriff Lowell was a kind man, mostly, but he had rules. And Jackson wasn't on any good side of the law. I don't want trouble here, he told Grace on a dusty Tuesday morning. I know what he did. I also know what he didn't get caught for. You don't want that mess around your girls. Grace stood her ground. He's done more for us in a week than anyone else has in 2 years. The sheriff sighed, scratched his jaw. I ain't looking to start a war. But if something happens, anything, you'll be the one left holding the blame. She nodded. She understood, but she didn't send Jackson away. Because by then, she'd seen it. How Nora had stopped flinching at sudden noises. How Rosie had started laughing again. How the house didn't feel so hollow at night. But still, she didn't trust the peace. Something about it felt borrowed, fragile. One night, she found Jackson staring at the horizon again. His hand rested on a locket he wore under his shirt, the chain just visible in the moonlight. She asked, You got someone out? System. Out there? Family. He shook his head slowly. Had a wife. Years back. She died before I could fix the things I broke. Grace looked down, her voice softer. That why you came here? He didn't answer, just closed his hand around the locket and said nothing. And in that silence, Grace understood something she hadn't before. Jackson had no hidden agenda, but he did carry something with him. A guilt that settled into the bones. The kind you can't shake off. The kind that makes a man reach out to save someone else, if only to feel like something he lost might matter again. Grace didn't forgive easily, but she saw him, and that was the start of everything that would come next. Spring came late that year, cold and wet and restless, as if the weather itself couldn't decide what to be. The ground was too soft to plant, and the creek swelled higher every week. Grace stood at the edge of the property one morning, shawl wrapped tight, watching the gray clouds roll in over the hills. Something had shifted, not in the air, but in her. Jackson had taken to fixing the barn roof in the afternoons, and she'd catch herself staring too long. He never asked for more than a cup of coffee, never said much unless it mattered. But she saw the way his eyes softened when Nora offered him wildflowers, or how he lifted Rosie onto his shoulders without hesitation when the mud got too deep. He belonged to them now, in a way that made her chest ache. But good things didn't last in Grace Whitaker's life. They never had. The trouble began with a letter. Not from the county this time, but from a private investigator. Folded inside a brown envelope addressed to Mrs. Grace Whitaker, Whitaker Farm. Inside were 2 pages, typed blunt and without emotion. Jackson Brandt is not who he says he is. The letter claimed Jackson was wanted under a different name in Arizona, Samuel Fletcher. It listed a bounty, a description, accusations of desertion, mail fraud, robbery. The words bled off the page, one after the other, heavy and cruel. Grace read it 3 times, sat down, then read it again. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was rage. She went to the shed behind the barn, fists clenched. Jackson was oiling the hinges of the old wagon door. He looked up, eyes meeting hers, sensing something wrong before she said a word. "This came today," she said, handing him the letter. He didn't flinch, just unfolded the pages and read them silently, then folded them back up with care. "So it's true," Grace said, her voice quiet and flat. Jackson stared down at the dirt. "Some of it. You told me your name was Jackson Brandt." "It is," he said calmly. "Now it is. I changed it years ago. You lied. I started over." She took a step back. "Why should I believe anything you say now?" He didn't try to explain further. Just said, "Because I never touched a dime of that bounty money. I walked away from the men who did. I tried to do good, even if I came from wrong." Grace didn't respond. Couldn't. The girls were inside, laughing at something, oblivious. That night, she didn't sleep. Sat up at the kitchen table, lamp burning low, hands trembling. She had trusted him, let him into their lives, let the girls love him. She thought about the letter, about the bounty, about the name Samuel Fletcher being whispered through the mouths of neighbors if it got out. By morning, she hadn't made a decision, but fate did it for her. The sheriff came back, this time not to warn, but to inform. "I got word from Colorado Springs. They're reopening a case involving Fletcher. There's talk of sending someone here to investigate." Grace's mouth went dry. How did they know he was here? Lowell glanced away. "Someone in town sent a letter. Anonymous, but it had your address." She knew who it was before he said it. Martha Dumley. She'd always had eyes too sharp for her own good. Grace nodded stiffly. "Is he going to be arrested?" Lowell sighed. "They're watching him, but unless they catch him doing something, my hands are tied. Doesn't mean the others won't act." When he left, she walked out to the field where Jackson was moving a pile of lumber. She didn't say anything right away. Finally, she asked, "If they come, what are you going to do?" He looked at her without fear. "I won't run." That made her heart twist. "Why?" "I'm tired of running," he said. "And you don't run from people who matter." She blinked hard, throat tight. "You should go. Tonight. Take one of the horses. Get to the mountains." But Jackson shook his head. "Grace, if I go, you lose everything. The girls, the land. You're barely holding on as it is." She stepped closer, gripping his sleeve. "And if you stay, you'll be dragged off in chains. I'll take that over watching them haul your daughters away." It was the first time she cried in front of him. That night, Rosie heard them whispering in the kitchen. She was always quiet when she wanted to be. She heard the words, bounty, sheriff, letter. She didn't understand all of it, but she knew what it meant when Grace clutched Jackson's arm and said, "I can't lose you too." The next day, the twist came. While Grace was gathering eggs, a man appeared at the edge of the woods. He wore a suit too fine for travel and shoes too clean for the farm. He introduced himself as Mr. Avery from the Office of Federal Claims, showed her a badge and a stack of documents. "I'm here to offer you a deal," he said calmly. Grace eyed the papers. "What kind of deal?" Mr. Avery didn't flinch. "You hand over Mr. Fletcher, Jackson Brandt, if you prefer, and we'll ensure full custody of your daughter's remains with you. In addition, you'll receive compensation for your cooperation." She stared at him. "You want me to betray him. I want you to protect your children. That's all." The paper said $500. Enough to keep the farm running for 2 years. Enough to make sure the girls had boots, school books, and food through the winter. When he left, she stood frozen in the yard, fingers tight around the paper. She didn't tell Jackson that night. She couldn't look him in the eye, but he knew something was wrong. He watched her from the porch, silent as always, his gaze following her every move. That was when the tension cracked. Later that week, someone slashed the fence. Chickens gone, wagon sabotaged, a message carved into the barn door. "Run, Fletcher." It wasn't just Martha now. The town had caught wind of the past, and their fear turned fast into violence. Jackson fixed the damage without complaint. Grace tried to help, but the silence between them was heavier now. The girls noticed. Rosie especially grew sullen. Nora asked why people were so angry. Grace had no answer that wouldn't shatter them. Then, one night, Grace found Jackson packing a saddlebag in the barn. "You're leaving," she said, voice hollow. He turned slowly. "If I stay, it puts you in danger." "They won't stop." Her chest caved in. "They won't stop either way." He hesitated. "I've never had a place like this. I didn't expect to find what I found here." Grace stepped forward. "And what did you find?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Forgiveness. Family. Something worth staying for." She couldn't stop the tears then. "You don't have to go." Jackson looked down. "If I don't, someone might get hurt. You, the girls. And I couldn't live with that." She reached into her pocket and held out the federal letter. Crumpled. Tear-stained. "They offer me a deal." He stared at it for a long time, then met her eyes. "Did you take it?" "No," her voice cracked. "I wanted to. I almost did. But I couldn't. You stood by me when no one else would. I won't sell out the only man who ever looked at me and saw more than a burden." Jackson nodded, jaw tight. "Thank you." But the choice wasn't theirs anymore. By dawn, 3 men rode in. 1 federal marshal, 2 deputies from Arizona. Grace stood on the porch as they approached. Jackson stepped out beside her, hands raised. Rosie and Nora watched from the window, tears spilling down their faces. Marshal Crowley dismounted slowly. "Samuel Fletcher, you're under arrest for outstanding warrants across state lines." Jackson didn't resist, didn't argue. But before they could cuff him, Grace stepped forward, placing herself between him and the men. "You don't get to treat him like a criminal in front of my girls," she said fiercely. "He's been more of a father than anyone else in this town." Crowley sighed. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job." "So am I," she said. "Protecting what's mine." Jackson touched her shoulder. "It's all right." They took him without force. No chains, no words. Grace stood in the doorway long after the dust had settled, clutching the shawl around her, the girls sobbing behind her. Everything had changed, but something had also been revealed. Jackson had never hidden out of cowardice. He had stayed out of love. And now, Grace would fight like hell to bring him back. Grace didn't sleep the night they took Jackson. The house felt colder than it ever had, not because of the spring wind sneaking through the cracks, but because the weight of absence clung to every corner. She sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the old boards groan as if the house itself was mourning. Rosie curled up on the floor with her arms wrapped around Miss Sally, the doll Jackson had once cradled so gently. Nora cried herself to sleep, then woke twice in the night calling out for him. In town, the story spread like fire on dry grass. Everyone had something to say now. Whispers filled the general store, the post office, the church pews. Grace Whitaker took in a wanted man. She let her daughters live with a criminal. What kind of mother doesn't know who's sleeping under her roof? But Grace walked through it all with her chin high, because if she faltered even for a second, the county would come back. And this time, she might not be strong enough to stop them. The first real consequence came with a letter from the Office of Children's Welfare. They had concerns again: ongoing instability, exposure to criminal influence. There would be another review, another hearing. Grace stood in the kitchen reading it over and over, her hands trembling, knowing exactly what they were doing. They were waiting for her to crack, waiting for her to fall apart. She didn't. Instead, she rode into town and stood in front of Sheriff Lowell's desk with fire in her chest. "I want to know where they took him," she said. Lowell looked up slowly, took in her pale face and tight grip on the edge of his desk. "Grace, that man's facing charges in 3 states. They won't give you visitation." "I'm not asking for permission," she said. "I'm asking for the truth." The sheriff hesitated, then leaned back with a sigh. "Last I heard, they were holding him in a temporary cell in Durango. They're waiting for transport to Arizona." Grace's heart twisted. "And no one thought I deserved to know?" "You're not his wife," Lowell said carefully. "You're not legally tied." The words stung more than she expected. Not his wife. Not anything on paper. Just the woman who let him sleep under a roof. The woman whose children called him something close to Pa. That night, she looked around the empty house and realized how badly she wanted to belong to someone again. How much she'd let herself need him. The next few days blurred. Grace split wood until her hands blistered, just to feel something. She worked the field even when the rain soaked her down to her bones. Nora caught a fever, and Grace sat by her side all night, wiping her forehead, whispering lullabies until the little girl's breathing slowed. When she finally slept, Grace cried into the crook of her arm, silent, shaking sobs she hadn't allowed herself before. Then came a church Sunday. Grace didn't want to go, but Rosie insisted. "We have to pray for him," she said softly. "It's what he'd do." They walked in late. The pews were full. Heads turned. No one smiled. The sermon was about righteousness, about staying on the right side of the law. The preacher never said Jackson's name, but every word felt like a blade. Grace stood up halfway through and led her daughters out into the sunlight. Chin lifted even as her cheeks burned. Outside, Martha dumbly waited. "You should have known better," she said, arms crossed. "Men like that don't change. They just wait for a woman like you to give them cover." Grace didn't answer. She just stared back, lips pressed tight. "You'll lose those girls," Martha added smug, "and it'll be your own fault." Grace didn't slap her, didn't scream, but she looked her dead in the eye and said, "If you had half the heart he did, maybe someone would have stayed with you." Back at the farm, the storm inside her only grew. She found herself snapping at Rosie, scolding Nora too harshly. She couldn't eat, couldn't breathe without feeling the loss of him pressing down on her ribs. Then came the worst moment yet. 2 men from the county showed up with a form, a final review scheduled in 2 weeks. And this time, they wanted the girls placed in temporary care pending outcome. Grace folded the paper slowly. "You're not taking them." One of the men, younger, flinched. The other, older and colder, said, "You don't get to decide anymore." "I do," she said quietly, "as long as I'm breathing." The next day, she rode to Durango, left the girls with an old friend of her mother's who still lived in the next hollow over. Took nothing but her coat and a bundle of fresh bread and a towel. The jail in Durango wasn't much, a squat brick building with one window and a bored-looking man behind a desk. He didn't want to let her in. "I'm here to see Jackson Brandt," she said firmly. "Or Samuel Fletcher. Whatever name you'll take." "He's not seeing visitors," the deputy replied. She took a deep breath. "He's not a criminal anymore. He's a father to my girls. I need 10 minutes." The deputy looked her over. Something in her eyes must have changed his mind, because a minute later, he opened the back gate and led her down a dim hall. Jackson looked up as she stepped into the cell block. He was thinner, darker under the eyes, but when he saw her, something softened in his shoulders. A kind of peace even behind bars. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," she replied. "I didn't know if you wanted me to." "I did," he said. "I just didn't want you hurt more because of me." She stepped closer, hands curling around the bars. "They're trying to take the girls." Again, his jaw tightened. "Because of me. Because the world doesn't think a woman alone can be enough." Jackson leaned forward. "Then let's give them reason to believe otherwise." "What are you saying?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He passed it through the bars. It was a ring. Not new. Old, worn, gold-dulled with time. "My mother's," he said. "It's all I have left of her. If I ever got a second chance at a life, I promised myself I'd use it well. If you'll take it, maybe it'll help." Grace stared down at the ring in her hand, heart pounding. "I'm not asking you out of desperation," he added. "I love you. I love them. And if I never walk out of this cell, I want the world to know where my heart stayed." She slid the ring into her coat pocket. "You'll walk out," she whispered, "even if I have to go to court myself and make them listen." They parted with a handshake, because touching would have broken both of them. Back home, something in Grace caught fire. She gathered every letter of character Jackson had written, One to the school board about Rosie's reading, one to the sheriff about the fence thieves, one to her about the girl's laughter bringing him back to life. She made a case. She wrote to the district judge, found a lawyer in Santa Fe who agreed to help off the record. She stitched a dress from scraps and ironed it smooth. She braided Rosie's hair and cleaned Nora's scuffed shoes. At the hearing, she stood in front of a panel of strangers and spoke with her entire soul. My daughters are not in danger. They are thriving because of a man you call an outlaw. But we call him Jackson. And Jackson gave them their childhood back. She handed over the letters, showed them the drawings the girls had made of Papa Jackson with flowers in his hands. She didn't cry until it was done. And when she stepped outside, the wind carried the last of the storm clouds away. They gave her a month, 1 month of supervised care, with the girls remaining at home. And 3 days after that, word came from Durango. The Arizona court had dropped 2 of the charges. Not all, but enough. Jackson could return on probation under conditions. A second chance. When she saw him again, walking up the road toward the house, her hands were in the soil, planting late beans. She looked up and froze. The girls ran first, screaming his name. He dropped to his knees and caught them both, laughing and crying at the same time. Grace stood slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt. He rose, eyes locking with hers. "Still want to wear that ring?" he asked softly. She nodded, then stepped forward and placed it on her finger herself. The night Jackson returned, the whole house stayed awake. Nora wouldn't leave his side. Rosie followed him like a shadow, afraid if she blinked, he might disappear again. Grace watched him from across the table, studying the way his hand trembled slightly when he lifted his cup. He was here, but he was different, quieter, heavier in the chest, like something still chained him to that cell in Durango. They didn't talk about what happened right away. Grace didn't press. But days passed, and she could feel the distance he tried to keep, even as he helped repair the gate, even as he tucked Nora in. One afternoon, as they shelled peas by the porch, Grace finally asked, "Why aren't you telling me?" Jackson didn't answer at first, just kept snapping open pods, slow and mechanical. Then, quietly, "There's one charge left. The worst one." She set down the bowl. "Go on. It's not just robbery," he said. "There was a fire in Tucson. A saloon job gone wrong. Years ago. I didn't light it, but I was there. 2 men died inside." Her stomach turned. "You never said." "I couldn't," he whispered. "I didn't want you looking at me like that." Grace didn't speak. She stood, arms crossed over her chest, looking out over the land. The fields they'd mended together. The clothesline where the girls' dresses danced in the breeze. She tried to match that past with the man who held Nora's hair back when she was sick. It didn't fit, but it didn't disappear either. "Do you regret it?" she asked at last. "I regret every step that led me to that door," he said. "But I didn't kill those men. I ran. That's my crime." She nodded slowly, unsure where to place the ache growing in her chest. "They'll find out. The county will use it." "I know. What are we supposed to do?" Jackson looked at her then, eyes full of something desperate. "You can walk away. Take the girls. Say you didn't know. You be telling the truth." She stepped closer. "That's not what I asked." He exhaled. "Then we face it together." But the world had other plans. The very next morning, the older man from the children's office returned with a woman in a stiff gray dress and a clipboard. They were there to perform an unscheduled evaluation. The moment Jackson stepped onto the porch, everything changed. The woman's eyes narrowed. "That's the man under probation, correct?" Grace nodded. "He's allowed to be here. Supervised and not overnight," the man corrected. Grace's hands balled into fists. "He's their guardian, whether you want to write it that way or not." They toured the home, took photos, spoke to the girls. Everything felt fragile, too clean, too quiet. As if they were trying to find something broken, just so they could say they were right. That night, Grace didn't sleep. Neither did Jackson. They sat at the edge of the bed, both staring at the same spot on the wall. "They'll come again," she said. "I know, and if they take them..." "They won't," he said. "We won't let them." But even as he said it, the front door creaked. Rosie stood in the doorway, clutching something in her hand. "I found this in the barn," she said quietly. It was a revolver, one of Jackson's, a weapon he was forbidden to have. Grace's blood ran cold. "I didn't know it was there," Jackson whispered, standing slowly. "I swear I thought I got rid of it." She looked at him, heart thudding. This could cost everything. He nodded. She reached out, took the gun from Rosie, and kissed her head. "Going back to sleep, baby. We'll take care of it." After she was gone, Grace turned to Jackson. "Why didn't you tell me you still had it?" "I forgot," he said, then shook his head. "No, I told myself it might be useful, in case someone came for the girls." Her heart twisted. "You can't protect them that way." "I know. It was a mistake. They buried it behind the shed that night." But something between them shifted again, trust strained thin. Not broken, not yet, but trembling. The next few days passed in a fog. The girls clung tighter. Grace tried to keep busy, cleaning, sorting, sewing. But everything felt like waiting. Then came the envelope. Thick, cream-colored, official. Marked with a red stamp. Final hearing notification. The court date was set, and it would determine one thing: whether Grace retained custody at all. The day before the hearing, Grace sat on the porch with her daughters on either side of her, braiding Nora's hair, while Rosie rested her head on her lap. Jackson sat a few feet away, sharpening the host silently. "I'm scared," Rosie whispered. "I am too," Grace said, brushing the hair from her daughter's cheek. "But being scared means you know what matters." That night, as the stars came out, Jackson pulled Grace aside. "I have to tell them the truth." She froze. "What truth?" "That I had the gun. That I broke the rule. That I didn't tell you." Her breath caught. "That could put you back in prison." He nodded. "But if I lie, and they find out, they'll take the girls anyway. And I won't have earned anything we've built." She cupped his face. "Are you sure?" "I'd rather be locked away honest than stay free on a lie." The next morning, they dressed in silence. Rosie wore her green ribbon. Nora clutched Miss Sally like a lifeline. Grace wore the ring Jackson had given her. Its band now shined with care. Jackson wore his only good shirt and left his hat on the table. At the courthouse, Grace held her head high as the questions flew. Did she knowingly house a felon? Did she allow her children unsupervised access to him? Was there a weapon present in the home? Jackson stood beside her and confessed. Calmly, clearly, without excuse. The courtroom murmured. Then came a voice from the back. "I'd like to speak." It was Martha Dunley. Every head turned. "I opposed her before," Martha said, stepping forward. "But I was wrong. I watched that man build her barn with his bare hands. I watched those girls go from frightened mice to bold little songbirds. If that's what a danger looks like, maybe we all need a little danger." The judge silenced the room with one lifted hand. "We will take this testimony into consideration." They were dismissed for recess. Outside the courthouse, Grace broke. She sat on the steps and buried her face in her hands. Jackson knelt beside her. "I'll stay," he said, "no matter what they decide." But they weren't ready for what happened next. An officer stepped outside, holding a second envelope. "Jackson Brandt." He stood. "You've been cleared of the final Arizona charge." The witness came forward, confirmed you weren't inside the building when the fire was set. Jackson blinked. Grace stared. The officer handed him a signed statement. "You're free." It took him a full minute to speak. I don't understand." Grace pulled him close. "You don't have to. Just breathe." An hour later, the judge delivered his ruling. Custody would remain with Grace Whitaker. Conditions lifted. No further review scheduled. Jackson turned to her slowly. "What now?" he asked. She looked at him. "We go home," she said. And they did. But not as a secret anymore. Not as a house barely holding together. They went home as a family. Open, seen, held together by hard truths and even harder forgiveness. Redemption didn't come in grand gestures. It came in the little things. Jackson teaching Rosie to ride. Grace planting a new row of lilacs. Nora singing in the kitchen again. The pain didn't vanish. The past didn't erase. But it no longer defined them. What defined them now was choice, and they chose each other. That night, as the stars settled quiet above a ranch house, everything felt still in a way it hadn't for a long time. No papers waiting to be signed. No knocks at the door. Just soft breathing from the girl's room and the occasional creak of the wind brushing the porch. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers running absently over the wooden armrest Jackson had carved for Nora's rocker. He was behind her, reading slowly through the worn journal she'd kept since the beginning of it all, when her world started to fall apart. And somehow, he showed up right in the middle of it. He set the journal down. "You never told me how bad it got. Before. I didn't think it mattered," she said softly. "Not once everything else started happening. It does. Because you kept fighting anyway." Grace turned to look at him. "So did you." For a long time, there had been a wall between them, made up of shame and secrets and fear that neither would fully belong in the other's life. But now everything was out. The truth, the past, the mistakes. And the strange thing was, it hadn't broken them. It had finally given them room to grow. The next morning, Grace walked down the field's edge, where the frost still clung to the tall grass. Nora came running after her, boots 2 sizes too big and face full of glee. "Mama, come see what I found." It was just a feather, bright red, from a bird too fancy for this stretch of land. But to Nora, it was treasure. To Grace, it was something else too. A reminder that beauty still appeared, even where it wasn't supposed to grow. Later that week, Martha came by, carrying a pie that was too hot to touch. "It's peach," she said almost gruffly. "You'll eat it whether you like it or not." Jackson smiled as he took it. "Yes, ma'am." Martha pulled Grace aside. "You know I was wrong. About you. About him. But most of all, I was wrong to think people don't change." Grace didn't say anything, just touched the older woman's hand. Some wounds don't need answers. Just acknowledgement. The real proof came quietly. In how the neighbors started waving again. In how Reverend Kelly offered Jackson a job fixing the church fence. And how Rosie came home from school one day and whispered, "They don't whisper about us anymore." The land softened that spring. The river ran clear and fast. The lilacs bloomed earlier than usual, as if the earth itself had stopped holding its breath. One evening, as the sun dropped low and golden over the ridge, Jackson stood beside Grace as she hung laundry on the line. He looked down at her hand, still rough from work, and slid his into it. "Marry me," he said, not like a question, like a promise. Grace didn't look surprised, just peaceful. "I thought you'd never ask." They married in the orchard behind the barn, with a white fence curled like a ribbon around the trees. Rosie and Nora wore wildflowers in their hair, and Jackson wore the same shirt from the hearing because Grace told him she liked the way it fit his shoulders. There was no big crowd, just the ones who stayed. The ones who saw everything and still believed. After the vows, Jackson lifted Nora in one arm, Rosie in the other, and Grace laughed so hard she had to hold onto the tree trunk to keep steady. Life didn't get easier. Fences still needed mending. Bills still came. And sometimes, on nights when thunder rolled too close, Jackson would sit up straight in bed, remembering things he didn't say out loud. But Grace was always there. A hand to his back, a word in the dark. "You're home," she'd say. "You're not alone anymore." That was the quiet miracle of it all. Not the court victory, not even a marriage, but the slow, patient rebuilding of something that had once been smashed to pieces. Trust, love, a sense of belonging. Even the girls had changed. Rosie grew bolder, steadier. Nora stopped hiding behind door frames when visitors came. They laughed more. And when Jackson called them his daughters, no one corrected him. Years later, when someone asked Rosie about her family, she would say, "My mama taught us to survive, but he taught us to stay." And Grace, standing by the stove or brushing out Nora's hair, would sometimes look up and remember a day long ago, a knock at the door, a man with a tired face and no words. A moment that had seemed small at the time, almost quiet, but had changed everything. Because sometimes salvation doesn't come with noise. It comes with silence. with patience, with someone who just stays. And in the end, maybe that's all anyone really needs. Not a hero, just someone who stays.